Hey everyone, this is section 3.6, Fiscal Policy. Now, firstly, as always, our definition, so it's the manipulations by the government of its own expenditures and taxes in order to influence the level of aggregate demand. I've used this image on the left because we've already seen extensively how money can influence behaviour. And that's really what governments are trying to do with their spending plans. And the image on the right is a shakedown. The government is shaking all the money loose from the public. This is how some dramatic people feel about the relationship between citizens and the government when it comes to tax collection. Now, spending is clearly going to take up a large part of fiscal policy. So where does the money come from? Now, I'm sure you're all thinking one word, tax. And yeah, that's where a lot of it comes from. But there are, of course, two types of tax. So firstly, direct taxes. These are ones paid directly to the government by the taxpayer. Direct taxes are imposed directly on income and corporate profits of corporate taxes, so personal income and corporate tax, and also wealth taxes. And in Australia, personal and income tax, that makes up over 70% of money to the federal government. Okay, indirect taxes, predominantly GST, but with significant contributions from tobacco, fuel, and alcohol, that makes up about 20% of the revenue of the Australian federal government. So where's the rest come from? Another source is government revenue from government-owned enterprises, so essentially government businesses. Governments often own utilities, such as gas, electricity, and water, and the bill revenue will therefore count as government revenue. In South Australia, much of this has been privatised, but in the eastern states and other countries, utilities are widely government-owned. Okay, so the same applies to transport. The fare revenue will go to governments where there is public ownership, and telecommunications in the days before mobile phones was all government-owned. Before Telstra, we had Telecom Australia, and the bill money, of course, would count as government revenue. And a postal service, finally, a postal service is one more enterprise that is commonly government run and therefore revenue producing. This accounts for most of the balance of revenue received by governments. The final source of government revenue is a less stable one, the selling of government assets. It's less stable because you can only sell it once. Selling government-owned enterprises is known as privatisation, a transfer of ownership from public to private. So some examples from Australia are Telstra, which was formerly Telecom, AGL, which was formerly the Electricity Trust of South Australia, Commonwealth Bank, so named because it was the Bank of the Commonwealth of Australia. So that's revenue. Now we need to classify the spending. So there's really three types. We've got our current expenditures. These are expenditures of a more ongoing basis. So salaries for government staff like me, ongoing hardware and software requirements, the emergency services, they're going to need recurrent funding. So anything where we can't just throw a bunch of money at it and then say it's done. Those would be what we call capital expenditures. Okay, so things that you build once. So to see the difference, streetlights are a good example to look at. So the streetlights themselves, putting them on the side of the roads, that would be a capital expenditure. But the electricity, paying for the electricity to make them work, that would be a current expenditure. Then there are transfer payments. So these are just cash payments to people, like unemployment benefits and disability pensions. As we know, transfers do not count towards GDP because no good or service is being produced. Whereas our current and capital transfers, they will count. Our current and capital expenditures, they will count. Okay, fiscal policy, just like monetary policy, is about shifting aggregate demand. I don't think you'll find this too hard, so we're going to race through it. The government spending part is easy. If it's government spending is increased, we get an increase in G and vice versa, right? Consumption, that can be affected in two ways. So transfer payments, if transfer payments are increased, then that's more disposable income for households, and that's going to mean more consumption. Income tax is another way to affect consumption. So for example, if income tax is increased, the shakedown, then that's going to be less disposable income for households and therefore less consumption. And finally, investment can be affected as well. So if transfers to firms increase, for example, subsidies, that means more money for firms, more disposable income for firms, and therefore more investment spending. Oh, and corporate tax, of course. Disposable income for firms will increase if they decrease corporate tax. They get to keep more of their profits. That's more money available for investment. All right, how it works, very similar to what we were looking at with monetary policy. So expansionary fiscal policy, we start out, we're only going to do it if we're in this sort of situation. We're not going to do it if we're in an inflationary gap. So this is a recessionary gap. We want to expand the economy. We do something that's going to increase AD. So what we saw on the previous slide, something that will increase AD. Contractionary policy, we're going to do if we are in an inflationary gap. We're overheating a little too much. So we will just do one of those things which will decrease aggregate demand and then shift it to the left like that. Now you have to draw this in the Keynesian model as well. That's the same concept. All it is aggregate demand shifting. Okay. So the goals of fiscal policy. So again, the government they don't have such a tight goal on inflation, but they still want low and stable inflation. And we can see that the shifts in aggregate demand are going to affect the inflation rate quite a bit. And so contractionary fiscal policy is going to weaken inflation. Expansionary fiscal policy is going to boost inflation, and also is going to reduce unemployment, which is going to be another goal of the fiscal policy, would be to reduce unemployment. We also, related to that, we want that stability in the economic environment. So by the same way, it reduces business cycle fluctuations by that stable economic environment. So again, a regular business cycle, now we saw this with monetary policy as well. What we're going to see is that contractionary fiscal policy is just going to smooth out those peaks, because peaks, heavy peaks often lead to heavy troughs, and our expansionary fiscal policy is going to even out the troughs, and it's just going to be a lot more stable. That's the goal of one of the goals of fiscal policy, and that of course should say fiscal policy up there. Just don't mind that. And the equitable distribution of income. So I want you to think of three ways that fiscal policy can lead to an equitable or more equal distribution of income. Okay, so hopefully you got answers like progressive taxation, transfer payments, and spending on public services like health and education. Okay, so of course, when we implement these policies for a more equitable or equal distribution of income, we get a Lorenz curve. Our Lorenz curve is going to shift inwards as the income distribution becomes more equal, and that of course means that the Gini coefficient will decrease. So if you're not sure about this stuff, make sure you go back and revise it. And just like with monetary policy, we're going to come back to the goal of external balance when we cover that section of the course. Now, onto the strengths of fiscal policy. Firstly, governments can target specific sectors of their economy. So, for example, before the end of car manufacturing in Australia, billions were spent propping up the industry. Monetary policy is a very blunt tool because it affects almost the whole economy equally when compared to some of the precision that fiscal policy can provide. When confidence is low, so in a deep recession, it can take a long time for the economy to get back to the full run employment. So remember how that works. Let's say we've got here our recessionary gap, what it takes, what the new monetarist classical economists believe is that wages will fall in the long run and eventually we'll get back to the full run employment here like this. Of course, John Maynard Keynes thought a little bit differently about that. So one thing he said was that in the long run we are all dead. And a little more specifically, he said that governments can spend their way out of recessions. And we've seen this in recent history. Governments the world over increasing spending by huge amounts to fight the recessions that have been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. They want to get back to that full run employment as soon as possible, not just wait the years and years and years that it could take. Now, fiscal policy does have some, does have some constraints too. One is that it's done by governments. They have a strong incentive to do things that will keep them in power. So in Australia, it's not been uncommon to see pre-election tax cuts. And very recently, in 2020, 2021, it came out that the government gave grants to sports clubs and grants to local areas to build car parks. It's worth tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. And they gave them in these areas where they needed votes in the marginal seats. So sometimes spending is done for political purposes rather than economic purposes. Also, in comparison to monetary policy, which can be implemented immediately, fiscal policy often can take much longer. The specificity of fiscal policy often means that there is significant planning that needs to occur. They have to identify something that needs to be done, they have to work out what to do, and then actually do it. So all these things, they take time. There have, however, been examples of governments taking quick, decisive action to stimulate the economy. So infrastructure is always a good investment, but you can't implement it straight away often. So the cash giveaways can work in the short term to get the economy moving again. Okay, we don't need to see that one again. Government injections can, of course, get us out of a recession, but the cost is often mounting government debt. Due to COVID, Australia's government debt increased by almost $200 billion in 1 year. This is debt that needs to be repaid in the future, and it can affect the future spending capabilities of the government, something that has to be taken into account. All right, that's all we've got before class, and we'll work together on some of this stuff a little bit more. Thanks.